Backyard Green Films is proud to present this episode of Agriculture with your host, Alara Bowman. Alara and her husband Rick travel throughout the land in their teardrop trailer that they have nicknamed Maggie, bringing you stories about their travels and the people they meet. They visit farmers, ranchers, and just about anyone who loves putting their hands in the dirt or their feet in stirrups. For the past 3 years, they have been filming a documentary about heritage breed animals entitled The Holstein Dilemma, Heritage Breeds, and the Need for Biodiversity. In those travels, they have gotten to meet some very interesting people. Here's one of those interviews.
Hi, this is Alara. Welcome back to our podcast. We're recording this podcast on Memorial Day, 2019. As most of you know, the United States sets aside this day as a national holiday to remember and honor those who've died serving in the military. Rick and I both have family members who fall in that category, and we remember them with joy and with sadness. Mankind seems to be a pretty conflict-oriented animal. We've had so many fights and battles and wars over the course of human history that the semantics of what name you call a conflict doesn't really seem important. People remember the huge cost in human life that occurs during war, and they should. As we've approached this national holiday, we've been thinking of how we're all impacted by the conflicts. Death comes to us in many ways in war: human, animal, vegetable, and otherwise. Since most of our wars have been land-based up until this time, we compound the human casualties with a broader brushstroke across the continents that seems almost sacrilegious to us now every time I cross the farmland. There are many stories of sadness and trauma and sacrifice, but there are a few that stick with me for all of those reasons. Both those that toil to produce the food to keep us going in times of conflict and the land that's been a casualty of war are just as important to remember. These are our heroes as well, and we wanted to share this story with you. The Siege of Leningrad. The Siege of Leningrad and the sacrifices made there is a story that makes me tear up every time I think of it. World War II started in 1939 and ended in 1945, and almost every country in the world was involved, so no one escaped the impact. One of the most horrible points, however, was the military blockade of Leningrad, Russia, by Nazi Germany, the siege. The Nazis blocked off the last road in or out in 1941, and that's how it stayed for almost 2.5 years. The bullets, air bombardment, and chaos would have been terrible. It's hard to know exactly what numbers are true in war, but the History Channel said that 600,000 people were evacuated before the blockade shut the routes out, and that left 2.5 million in the city. Think about that. I don't know about you, but I hit the grocery store about every single week. If I had to live out of the food in my cupboard, I could probably last 2 months tops, and that includes the emergency supplies. I can only imagine the 6-month mark in a closed city of 2.5 million. They were eating sawdust, dirt, and each other as the famine went on. I won't go over the details of the next 2 years there, but at the end, the estimate is that 800,000 civilians died in the siege. The part of the story that I want to remember is one known to scientists the world around, but not necessarily to the rest of us. It's my understanding you have been honored by the Russian Academy of Sciences.
Yeah.
And I read the story on the siege of Leningrad.
Yeah.
And the scientists that died of starvation. And I cried reading just the piece that I read. I was so moved by it. As a scientist and as someone who has spent his life doing this ethical and social justice issue, you could see all of the different components of history and of humanity and of seed saving coming together in that act. It's sort of representative. What was that experience like for you going there?
I've been lucky in my life to have met a lot of great people and have had the opportunity to visit and do some work at the Vavilov Institute in St. Petersburg quite a few times. And that's a pilgrimage for those of us in this field. Because of the heroic actions of these people who literally starved to death during the siege of Leningrad. Leningrad was, now St. Petersburg, was surrounded by the Nazis for about 900 days. People were starving to death. A couple 100,000 people starved to death. They were eating soil. It was just an amazing situation. And here were these scientists in a building on St. Isaac's Square with tins of boxes of seeds, rice, corn, wheat. In other words, with food. And they could have eaten that food, but they chose to conserve the diversity and starve to death. And there were about 13 of them that starved to death in basically 1 month in December, I think, 43. And why did they do that? First time I was there, I asked this old woman who was working there, well, what was going on here? What was the culture inside this building? What were people telling themselves inside this building? And I'll never forget it. She said that we thought the world was going up in flames, and that the diversity in this building was what was going to save the world after the war. And so, of course, we couldn't eat it because we were going to need this to reestablish agricultural systems. Well, the thing is that we might not be in such a dramatic situation, having a world war right now, but we still have to reestablish agricultural systems. We have to do that on a daily basis and a yearly basis because there's all turnover, something's always happening out there. So I thought, after that first visit, I thought, well, this is the most fundamental question in the world because this involves the biological foundation of agriculture, and there are very few things that could be more important than that. You screw that up, you lose that, everything else, is off the table. And here were these people who made the ultimate sacrifice to conserve this diversity. They starved to death. We're not being called upon to starve to death. We can conserve this diversity without killing ourselves. So I think we can go to a little bit of inconvenience ourselves and honor that tradition of people who did make that sacrifice. And we can figure out, in whatever way that we can do it, as people who maintain these rare breeds, as people who eat them, frankly, as people who make a business out of processing them and making products, as people who write their senators and congresspersons to say, hey, we need a little bit more attention paid to this resource. And please fund the government programs and other programs to make this possible. There's something everybody can do, whether you live in an apartment or you live in a big farm. And I just think, from an ethical standpoint, from a moral standpoint, we all have a stake in this. And I can't see why, in a sense, we're all not involved in the way that we can be involved. Again, we don't have to starve ourselves. We just, there are a lot of things we can do that are positive that don't involve making that sacrifice. And why wouldn't we? What's our excuse?
You can read Cary Fowler's rendition of it in more detail on the Huffington Post website entitled The Second Siege: Saving Seeds Revisited. The story is that of the scientists at the Pavlovsk experiment station just southeast of Leningrad. This station housed a huge collection of crop diversity, including storage of the Soviet Union's 6,000 variety breeding stock collection of tubers and seeds. When they saw that the army was coming their way, the scientists started to harvest frantically. They risked German artillery fire to desperately dig up the tubers in the field and stored them in the basement at what was then the most famous seed bank in the world. Then the blockade hit. Then one of the worst winters in recent memory hit. All through this, and the shelling and the famine and the starvation that followed, the scientists and staff protected the seeds and tubers at the Pavlovsk experiment station. 30 of these brave and principled people died of starvation, surrounded by bags of rice, potatoes, and seeds. Why did they do this? They knew that this collection of seeds and tubers would be absolutely necessary for reestablishing Russia's agriculture after the war. Those in the know in agriculture will tell you how important breeding stock of any kind is on a farm. If you have nothing to plant this year, you have nothing to eat next year. If your entire country's living agricultural history is represented in that collection, it's not only next year's food, but also your entire culture that's on the line. Dying of starvation and surrounded by food to preserve generations following you that you will never see is one of the bravest ways to die for a country that I could ever imagine. I believe that they deserve remembrance.
On this Memorial Day, we want to thank those who served and those who gave all.